I still remember the way Andre looked at me that morning, his fingers nervously tapping the battered edge of the hospital counter. The sunlight tried its best to slip through dusty windows, catching on the dried blood stains that never quite left the linoleum. He wore his white coat like a shield, but exhaustion had crept into the seams. I saw the weight on his shoulders, a heaviness that wasn't just about tired feet or endless patience. It was the kind of exhaustion that seeps into the soul when you can't see a way out. As a doctor, he was supposed to save lives, not worry about whether the electricity would stay on until the next morning or if painkillers would last through the night. Yet here we were, caught in the middle of a war that didn't care about diplomas, good intentions, or even clean hands. There's this lie people tell themselves, that if you work hard, do the right thing, and help others, you'll be safe. Andre believed that, or at least he used to. Every day, the calls for help became cries for miracles. The payment for his work stopped coming in, first a week late, then a month, until no one could remember the last deposit. Needles ran out. Gloves disappeared. The family clinic, our safety net, unraveled like an old sweater. Word quietly circled that neighbors were pawning furniture for antibiotics, that friends borrowed against the future because the present was already too broken. Each choice shrank our world. Each bill left unpaid. Each creditor at the door. Each desperate conversation around the kitchen table tightened the grip of panic. The part no one wants to talk about is how despair changes a person. At first, you count every penny, then every excuse. You tell yourself it's only temporary. That one more late notice won't matter. You bargain with fate. If only we can make it through this week, maybe something will change. But hope is fragile when you feel hunted by deadlines, when you see the fear in your family's eyes, and when your own reflection starts to look like a stranger. We learned that survival cuts deeper than pride. The world expects heroes to stand tall, but sometimes heroes crawl. It was in this suffocating quiet that I discovered the real enemy isn't just debt or empty shelves. It's that slow erosion of right and wrong. When Andre first heard whispers about the corridor, a shadowy network smuggling medical supplies across the border, he didn't mention it to me. Not at first, but I saw the calculation start behind his eyes, the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of breaking the rules. It's the kind of math you never practice in school, the kind you only learn when you're cornered. He didn't want luxury. He wanted his daughter's fever to break, wanted to pay the rent before police tape showed up on the door, wanted to keep old promises in a world that kept breaking new ones. I wish I could say the decision was clear and clean, a line we easily crossed. The truth is, it ate at us from the inside out. Every hurried phone call, every coded message with the fixers in the alley behind the bakery, every brown box that arrived late at night. Each one saved a patient, but added a new kind of price tag. We learned that desperation is its own currency, and every transaction carves a little more off your sense of self. The room where we sorted bandages and vials became a confessional. Could we both face the mirror in the morning, pretending we hadn't traded one kind of risk for another, telling ourselves that the end would justify the means? At night, when the city was quiet, I wondered if other families were making the same terrible choices just to keep breathing. If you've ever stood with your back to the wall, rent due, final notices piling high, a family depending on you for more than just answers, you know this feeling. It's not some abstract theory or best-selling advice. It's raw, it's relentless, and it strips you bare. The world calls it resilience, but inside, it feels like barely hanging on. When you're caught in the collision between duty and survival, when the map in front of you is just blank space, how far would you go? What do you tell yourself to sleep at night? This is not a story about triumph or defeat. It's about what it means to be human when the ground disappears beneath you. Andre and I learned that without a plan, urgency will always write the next chapter, and that survival, however noble, can come at a price you never intended to pay. Before you judge, before you draw lines, step with us into this story. There's a lot more to unpack about how we found ourselves here, and how the way out might begin. The morning after Andre's first foray into the underworld of supply, the air in our apartment was thick with a tension we didn't dare name. Plates clinked quietly at breakfast. Cereal boxes stood sentry-like on the table. Andre's hands trembled slightly as he passed the orange juice, a detail our daughter picked up on. "Dad, are you cold?" she asked, her voice pulling him back. He forced a tired smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. That small moment haunted me into the clinic, surfacing alongside every patient's plea and paperwork stack. Our lives, once guided by clear-cut answers and practiced routines, now teetered on the edge between what had always felt right and what necessity now demanded. Yet, beneath that discomfort, something more insidious began to grow. The gradual rewriting of what felt acceptable. Quiet rationalizations became companions in our daily exchanges. It was as if our conscience negotiated in whispers before sleep, bartering a sliver of peace in exchange for the promise of one more safe day. I caught Andre staring out the kitchen window longer than usual, his reflection tangled up with questions he never spoke aloud. Choices that once would have brought a hard no, now weighed differently, as if morality, under stress, melted and settled in new shapes. As weeks blurred together, we noticed the world outside reflecting our gray zone. Even those lauded for justice and order started bending lines to keep their own afloat. The bakery across from us, always reliable, quietly swapped name-brand flour for back-alley alternatives just to bake the next day's bread. The pharmacist next door began trading rare medications for whatever customers could afford, whether it was cash, an old radio, or a favor owed in the future. Every set of eyes held stories of calculations, compromises, and new rules drawn hastily in the sand. That collective slide from certainty to improvisation created a peculiar solidarity. Each of us complicit in rewriting the script because, without that flexibility, there was no script at all. Curiously, this new version of survival reshaped what we noticed. I started to see how quickly trust can unravel and how suspicion creeps into mundane exchanges. Each knock at the door sent a prickle of anxiety through our bones. Deliveries arrived wrapped in secrecy. A battered medical bag dropped behind a neighbor's trash bins, an envelope of cash exchanged in the parking lot at dusk. Every act of resourcefulness stitched together a temporary safety net, but also threads of paranoia and guilt. The more our skills adapted to these workarounds, the further we drifted from the certainty that used to define our place in the world. Personal boundaries softened, then eroded. Andre, once adamant about never accepting gifts from patients, began bringing home thank you bags, sometimes fresh bread, other times expensive chocolates or bottles of wine, all obviously out of place given everyone's dire straits. I watched my own excuses multiply. We deserve a small comfort, I'd mutter, justifying a new scarf or a late-night pastry, reasoning that every ounce of relief, however fleeting, was a balm against the relentless stress. But the most striking shift lingered in our dreams. Nights became battlegrounds, restless with half-remembered fears and images of futures we couldn't quite banish come daylight. Anxiety colored every interaction, from navigating tight-lipped conversations with suppliers to calculating which bill could be paid late with the least consequence. Even hope, what little remained, felt fragile, flickering like a candle starved for air. In this landscape, I began to understand how despair warps the rules, whispering that pragmatism trumps principle. No longer was it just about making it through. It was a question of what we'd still recognize in ourselves once the storm passed. Standing at the border of old values and new necessities, I pressed my palm to the window and wondered not just about escape routes, but about what remained of us, of our reflection, on the other side. I found myself lingering in the back office after closing hours, tracing the outline of worn ledger pages with tired fingers. Numbers blurred, expenses, shortfalls, promises half-kept. A faint humming from Andre's study signaled his own vigil. Late-night phone calls, hushed but urgent, wove through the walls. As evening settled, I sensed the subtle transformation in our routines, as if financial pressure had become a sculptor, quietly refashioning not only our habits, but also our sense of possibility. Anxiety still pulsed beneath the surface, but now a crucial shift emerged. A faint glimmer of curiosity about the origins of our struggles, and a new drive to explore the forces shaping our beliefs about scarcity, effort, and value. Instead of surrendering to dread, I began dissecting my earliest ideas about money. Scraps of memory stitched together from overheard conversations, tense glances across dinner tables, and well-meaning advice that always seemed to warn about disaster instead of potential. It struck me how deeply rooted these scripts were, how easily I'd accepted them as absolute truths. The cultural noise in our neighborhood told us to keep everything bottled up, to act like money didn't matter as long as one was good. Yet, beneath the surface, invisible pressures directed each decision, influencing which opportunities felt out of reach long before any real obstacle rose up. Gradually, I started observing others with fresh eyes. Take Mrs. Oliveira next door, for instance. She refused to let her children see her fret over bills, always insisting that problems sort themselves out. Yet her avoidance wasn't serenity. It was a practiced denial that sanded down expectations until risk itself seemed safer to ignore. Meanwhile, old Mr. Garcia lectured everyone about the evils of borrowing, recounting stories of ruined fortunes. His warnings had sunk into Andre's bones, shaping not only what risks he took, but which dreams he'd ruled out from the start. This interplay between inherited advice and personal conviction spun an intricate web, and, for the first time, I recognized how much of my own anxiety came less from actual shortfalls and more from clinging to other people's fears as if they were universal laws. Deeper still, I questioned the stories I told myself. As a child, I'd watched adults keep their bank records under lock and key, discussing anything financial in code. Their secrecy, meant to protect, only bred an unspoken sense of taboo. Open conversations about ambition or sustainable prosperity seemed almost heretical, as if aiming for anything more than survival was greedy or naive. Only now, with crisis tearing away the old walls of silence, could I acknowledge that real change required stripping away these outdated narratives and seeing my relationship with money as something living, something that could evolve. This inner excavation left me both unsettled and strangely empowered. If so much of my outlook was inherited or simply absorbed, perhaps it could be consciously rewritten. Andre, too, found himself wrestling with memories of his father laboring extra shifts, his mother pinching every penny with pride and shame in equal measure. We spoke in low voices about how their sacrifices shaped us, not to judge, but to understand the constraints we'd never questioned before. A flicker of hope surfaced. Maybe it was possible to break patterns, to choose new reference points, to mold the language we used about earning, spending, and envisioning a future beyond anxiety. That night, as I watched Andre nod off in his chair, I wondered what it would feel like to truly claim ownership over our financial mindset, to sift through what belonged to us and what we'd simply inherited. Was it possible to make space for new beliefs, ones that didn't carry the burden of fear or shame? The question hung heavy in the air but brought with it the raw material for transformation, a shift rooted in awareness, waiting to be carried forward into our next uncertain dawn. The next time I found myself alone with Dr. Cataldo, our senior nurse, he wasn't clipping discharge papers or sterilizing trays. Instead, he stood before the locked storage cabinet, key dangling from his thumb, gaze steady. "You know," he murmured, voice heavy with experience. "Everyone's got their myths. Sometimes we believe what suits us, just to get by." His words lingered, sharper than the disinfectant scent that clung to our uniforms. His point gnawed at my composure. It occurred to me that certain truths about money had embedded themselves in my thoughts like stubborn splinters, that working longer automatically led to security, or that financial struggle implied personal failure. Every hallway conversation and media headline seemed to reinforce those tales, until they masqueraded as common sense. Yet, standing in that sterile room, it hit me. Maybe the narratives I'd clung to were nothing more than worn-out fairy tales, comfort stories we inherit but never question. Picturing my own patience brought this realization into sharper focus. There was the young teacher who confessed, tears in her eyes, that she'd stopped treating herself to simple pleasures, books, a favorite pastry, because she believed sacrifice was the only way to prove responsibility. Then came a retired mechanic, proud but haunted, convinced that past mistakes with loans had stained his future forever. Their beliefs didn't merely color emotions. They shaped real decisions, narrowing possibility and dimming hope. These weren't abstract notions. They became fate, if left unchecked. Reflecting on Andre's predicament, fresh doubts shivered through me. Was the emergency route he'd chosen, those dangerous late runs across shadowy alleys, truly the only path, or had fear and exhaustion made alternatives invisible. Every story of desperation comes with rules scribbled in invisible ink, whispering who deserves help, how much is enough, and whether it's foolish to dream of more. As I traced the stethoscope hanging from my neck, it felt less like a badge of competence and more like a chain forged from hand-me-down beliefs. Ignorance wasn't neutral, it was perilous. The day our electricity nearly flickered out, Andre caught my eyes and said, voice trembling, "Maybe all we can do is try to hang on." For a fleeting moment, I nodded, eager for relief, but something inside rebelled. Was endurance really a virtue, or another convenient myth that kept us inching forward but never truly living? Patterns emerged. Friends who inherited the mantra, "money can only be earned through backbreaking labor," always seemed to sabotage any break or opportunity. Others, haunted by warnings that people with savings become selfish, found themselves trapped in cycles of endless giving, forgetting their own oxygen masks. Brushing those stories aside wasn't easy. Still, I began to wonder, what else could be possible if we replaced these limiting scripts with something expansive? Could we tell ourselves, and believe, that resourcefulness wasn't cheating, but creativity, that past stumbles were teachers, not dead ends, that survival could coexist with dignity and, one day, even abundance? To ground these hopes, I tried a new ritual. Each morning, I stood at the bathroom mirror, staring past bloodshot eyes to the person underneath, and reminded myself, circumstances aren't sentences. Worth is not measured by debt or dollar signs. I am allowed to rebuild. On paper, those were gentle affirmations. Spoken aloud, they felt like pebbles tossed in a pond, ripples expanding silently, altering the shape of my self-talk one brave breath at a time. Of course, myths don't surrender easily. Knots tangled over years require persistence to unravel. Yet something remarkable happened. As I shifted my internal language, practical options that used to seem unreachable, like negotiating with creditors or asking for help without shame, slowly gained clarity. The weight of inherited stories softened, making space for flexible thinking. Andre noticed too. He caught himself before apologizing for his exhaustion, and instead voiced what he hoped for, not merely what he feared. Peeling back these myths didn't solve every problem overnight. Even so, each false belief exposed made resistance feel a little lighter. We discovered that narratives could be redrawn. That possibility was not a distant promise, but something we could gradually make real, together. Late one afternoon, I found myself gazing at Andre's battered sketchbook, left open on the kitchen counter. A single note scribbled in the margin caught my eye. Each day has its answer, and its cost. I traced the line, realizing how our lives had distilled into problem-solving hour by hour, never daring to imagine we might have influence over anything larger. Yet, in the midst of unpredictability, a radical thought surfaced. Transformation didn't always require a sweeping overhaul. Sometimes it seated itself in the smallest, most stubborn corners of routine. Moments later, as I sat surrounded by unpaid bills and broken pencils, a memory surfaced. An old neighbor, known for insisting on thanking life's hardships as if they were teachers. At the time, I thought her eccentric. But now, pressed as we were, her words shimmered with new relevance. Determined not to let our circumstances swallow us whole, I started a new ritual. Each morning, before the hospital shift began, I hunted for one aspect of our reality that still shimmered with possibility. Maybe it was the sound of our daughter humming as she dressed, or the sunlight slanting through the living room, catching grains of dust like flecks of hope. These tiny noticings became an anchor, a deliberate act of recognizing there was goodness, however fragile, amid the chaos. Instead of allowing anxiety to dictate my actions, I reached for a pen and began to map out small, concrete steps, practical, not grandiose. One evening, I locked myself in the bedroom, determined to write a complete inventory of debts, due dates, and suppliers, refusing to let fear manipulate the facts. Surprisingly, the act of facing the details head-on broke a certain spell. No monster lurked in the numbers themselves, only in the shadows cast by avoidance. Laying everything plain on paper, gritty and honest, gave me back a measure of control over decisions. By visualizing the whole mess, I could finally filter urgent from important, strategize my resources, and define which action counted as genuine progress that week. New habits weren't just about paperwork. In the operating room, I began making short mental lists, supply levels, which patients needed priority, what could wait. This same process spilled into life at home. Each evening, I jotted down what went well, however minor. If Andre managed to negotiate an extra shipment or the clinic kept the lights on, it went in my journal. Over time, these fragments stitched together a subtle confidence. Small wins counted. Waiting for miracle solutions no longer felt necessary, because change no longer seemed a distant phenomenon but a cumulative process, woven through persistent, bite-sized effort. This period also awakened my sense of resourcefulness. Once, I would have bristled at the thought of asking for help or bartering services, afraid it meant admitting failure. Now, with pride stripped to its core, I phoned an old colleague and proposed a skills swap, medical advice for discounted groceries. Our daughter joined in, organizing toys for a community sale, her laughter ringing out in ways I hadn't heard in months. These collective efforts didn't solve every problem overnight, but they sparked a spirit of possibility and made every person in our orbit feel like a vital thread in the fabric of endurance. In addition, visualizing a future beyond the current storm became my lifeline. Stormy nights found me sprawled on the couch beneath a battered old blanket, closing my eyes, picturing our family free from looming bills and frantic bargaining. Each detail, family dinners without hushes and worried looks, holidays without a calculator at the table, started as a daydream, but soon it colored my motivation in the waking hours. The more I pictured success, the more my actions began to bend quietly in that direction. Altogether, tiny tweaks and honest acknowledgments built an inner scaffolding sturdy enough to withstand setbacks. Rather than reaching for quick escapes, I trusted in these incremental changes to shift our trajectory. As Andre once murmured, placing his hand over mine late at night, it's the daily acts that form the foundation for rescue. And in those quiet, diligent habits, seeds of transformation took root, steady, unglamorous, but utterly ours. I remember sitting across from Andre in our dimly lit living room, the distant city sirens nothing but a faint echo, feeling a quiet strength beginning to build between us. Our journey had already forced us to take actions we'd never imagined, but an entirely different challenge hovered in the silence, claiming a new sense of self that wouldn't crumble under financial storms. This wasn't about tactics or daily checklists. It was the invisible layer underpinning every choice, our sense of who we were and who we believed we could become, even as external chaos pressed in. For years, I'd lived with a definition of myself tightly woven from credentials, patient gratitude, and the security of routine. Losing those anchors shook my sense of purpose far more than losing money ever could. The shifting ground beneath our feet called for something different, a reimagining of purpose not tied to the ebb and flow of resources, but springing from values and vision. It took watching Andre tending to an elderly neighbor, refusing compensation, for me to see the nature of worth in a new light. If the old structures fell away, what surfaced was integrity, empathy, and a drive much deeper than entitlement or pride. As evenings passed, a subtle transformation unfolded. Conversations changed from desperate calculations to what we wanted to stand for, regardless of what we could control. Andre began writing small notes, short reminders of our commitments, both to those we cared for and to ourselves. Be the calm, one sticky note by the door read. Protect hope, another on the bathroom mirror. Each message whispered an intention, a steady counterpoint to the daily noise of lack and fear. In turn, our daughter became an unexpected teacher in identity. One afternoon, she gathered torn scraps of paper, crayons in hand, fashioning a collage with the big, careful letters. We help. We love. We build. There was no trace of our recent scrambling in those words, only a distilled reflection of who we wished to be, drawn from what was true in the smallest acts. Watching her, I realized new identities flourish not in the absence of pressure, but in the willingness to bring yourself forward, flaws and all, into whatever challenges arise. As this new foundation took root, my choices began to shift, almost without effort. Where previously I fixated on what we lacked, I noticed instead the relationships and strengths we'd nurtured. Conversations with colleagues moved from transactional to deeply supportive. Unprompted, Andre's old classmates began sharing trusted advice about payment plans and financial counseling, not as rescuers, but as co-travelers envisioning a way through. We grew less hesitant to say, "This is tough, but we'll manage," not as an empty assurance, but as a declaration shaping what came next. Moral complexity, always lurking at the edges, now felt like an invitation toward growth rather than a source of shame. Decisions weren't defined strictly as success or failure, but as steps within a journey of expanding maturity. In moments of doubt, I leaned on a simple question: what would the strongest, most honest version of our family do? That single reflection anchored my resolve, reminding me our dignity didn't depend on wins or losses, but on persistence, kindness, and process. What surprised me most, as days lengthened and bills gradually reduced, was how much lighter I felt stepping out my front door. The self I carried now was toughened by necessity, but also gentler, more agile, unafraid to start again if needed. Prosperity, I learned, wasn't a hidden prize waiting at the finish line. It was a stance, a readiness to act with courage and compassion, no matter how uncertain the future felt. In discovering who we could be despite hardships, I saw the seeds of something enduring, an identity prepared for whatever tides may come. Reflecting on this journey so far, I'm struck by how resilient the human spirit becomes when boundaries slowly dissolve and uncertainty swells like incoming tide. We carry old frameworks, those familiar blueprints, only to watch them warp under unfamiliar pressure, demanding reinvention. Perhaps that's why the air feels different in these moments, as if each inhale draws possibility from the cracks left by former certainties. I've grown attuned to the invisible threads running beneath our actions. Like roots weaving together in the dark, these unseen connections fortify us in unseen ways. Some evenings, sitting quietly by the window, I sense how each decision stacks atop previous ones, forming a mosaic neither neat nor predictable. It's less the neat resolution of a puzzle and more the organic unfolding of something wild and persistent. Conversations around the table have acquired a new cadence. Hopefulness sitting comfortably beside caution, both shaped by trials that demanded new vocabulary. We've learned to listen for cues beneath what's spoken, recognizing that sometimes it's the silences, the sidelong glances, that reveal how change is taking root. The language we share now is richer and braver, grown from days when the only way forward was through the thickets of ambiguity. At times, I feel we're navigating rough waters in a vessel refashioned mid-journey, patching sails and recalibrating direction as currents twist beneath us. Trust in the process has acquired a texture, no longer naive, but layered with the grit of reality. With every step, new patterns emerge not through grand gestures, but in the subtleties of behavior, in the way doubt and optimism mingle across dawnlit kitchens or hospital corridors. Action, once reactive, now pulses with intention, even if that current is understated. We no longer measure strength solely by endurance, but by the capacity to adapt while holding fast to a sense of self that remains intact through the maelstrom. A curious harmony arises, shaped by acknowledging that ethical dilemmas aren't always solved outright, but rather negotiated with patience and humility. Choices, formerly painted in the stark contrast of good and bad, now shimmer with complexity, a spectrum of motivations revealing their own hard-earned wisdom. The narrative pulling us forward isn't strictly one of restitution or redemption, but of discovery, uncovering resources in each other and ourselves that perhaps lay fallow until crisis called them forth. The texture of these days is rougher, yes, but woven with gold, new resolve, renewed faith in small steps, cohesiveness born of shared vulnerability. Through these trials, I find fractures beginning to heal not because pain vanishes, but because understanding softens the edges. Bit by bit, we release the familiar anchor weight of old stories, floating instead on the buoyancy of choices made with eyes wide open. Even missteps feel less damning, reframed as lessons hinting at sturdier futures. I watch Andre and those around us grow more attentive to the idea that prosperity can coexist with struggle, and that dignity surfaces not in spite of hardship, but often because of how it is met. So, I invite you, wherever you might find yourself in this narrative, to pause with me in this quietly potent space before the next step. Can you feel the momentum that's gathered? The subtle shift as old beliefs loosen and fresh pathways materialize at the horizon's edge? The groundwork has been laid, not in grand declarations, but in the measured, persistent heartbeat of change. We stand poised now, not untouched by hardship, but enriched by all we have weathered, ready, perhaps, to shape the story's closing act with the wisdom we've earned. After so many nights spent at the window, watching halos of city light flicker against cracked paint, hearing the hush of footsteps return from those tense errands, I've come to realize that survival isn't marked by a single, triumphant moment. It's measured instead by the persistence of ordinary acts performed despite throbbing worry, by the quiet way Andre would slip his hand into mine over unpaid bills, assuring me not with promises, but presence. It's in these hushed exchanges and in the relentless determination to keep going that true resilience found its footing. Some evenings, I catch a glimpse of US reflected in the darkened glass, faces thinner, but eyes holding a new glint, something forged not from certainty, but from endurance and small choices to keep faith in ourselves amid scarcity. I remember the pulse of hope underneath dread, how it sparked in the most unexpected places, in the soft gratitude of a healed patient, in a neighbor's shy offer to share what little remained, in laughter that bubbled up despite it all. These moments stitched together a kind of strength I never expected to claim. Hardship, I've learned, exposes more than weakness or limits. It reveals the intricate architecture of loyalty, ingenuity, and a stubborn refusal to surrender dignity, even as old definitions of safety dissolve. It asks uncomfortable questions. What truly matters, and how far am I willing to bend to protect what I love? Though the answers shift with each challenge, what endures is an unspoken agreement to redefine success, not as mere comfort, but as the capacity to create meaning, even under fire. It might be easy to believe that redemption lies in some grand escape, a sudden windfall, or the dawn that finally chases fear away. But true liberation arrived quietly, in the habit of facing each day fully awake, meeting hard numbers head-on, reaching out to those who might understand, allowing myself to hope for something better while accepting the pace of progress. As I watched Andre move from anxious calculation toward more deliberate, compassionate choices, I finally accepted that no outside force would hand us the life we sought. We would shape it, one negotiation, one act of courage, one honest conversation at a time. That is what lingers now, the willingness to rebuild, not from shame, but from an expanded sense of possibility. I want to remember not simply the struggle, but the emergence, how we reclaimed a sense of agency, even as certainties vanished, how we discovered connection, purpose, and unexpected generosity growing from difficult soil. These gifts remain, independent of balance sheets and shifting tides. As I prepare to close this chapter, my hand instinctively returns to Andre's, a silent vow between us. No harm can erase the lessons etched in these scars, nor diminish the integrity we held, even at our most desperate. So to anyone standing where we once did, pressed hard by circumstances and nearly out of breath, know that worth and potential outlast any present storm. Real change brews quietly, compounding within daily acts of insight and intention. Hold to hope a little longer than comfort suggests. Shape your own exit, brick by brick, from inside the tempest. In doing so, you just might find within yourself a steadiness capable of weathering so much more than you ever feared, and a readiness, finally, to rise towards something new.